Hello and welcome to this India Today special. India, it would seem, has been the flavor of the season in the backdrop of the G20 summit. But are we truly a rising economic power as is being projected? Or are there many mountains left to climb? Joining us now is someone who has a ringside view from a global perspective to what's happening in India and the world. I'm joined by Dr. K. Subramaniyam, the Executive Director of the IMF for India, as well as the former Chief Economic Advisor. Appreciate your joining us, Dr. Subramaniyam. Good to have you here in India.
My pleasure, Rajdeep.
The G20 summit has created a lot of buzz around rising India. The fact that we've emerged from the 10th largest economy in the world to the 5th, and the hope that we will reach 3rd in a few years. How much of that hype do you believe is deserved? And how much does it conceal certain other concerns in your view?
Rajdeep, you would recall the interview that we had just after the first quarter of 2020. At that time, I had said that there's going to be not only a V-shaped recovery after the pandemic-induced lockdown, that the economic growth in India will be very, very good. So it is not just that we required a G20 to basically tell the world that India is rising. India's growth, if you look at 7.2% last year, and when the revised numbers will come in, it is my estimation that the growth will be closer to 7.5%. With the first quarter growth being 7.8%, India has been, doing really well, and the G20, in particular, really signals the stature that India has now come to command in the world, in the Committee of Nations. When you look at the fact that a unanimous declaration was signed, a very seminal proposal, and something that everybody agreed to, which is the corridor, the infrastructure corridor, which I have called it the new Silk Route, together with the India displaying leadership on financial inclusion, on the public digital infrastructure, and also on cryptocurrency. I think these are very, very important moves, clearly. So any doubts that people like you would have had should have been settled by now.
But I must still raise, my job is to raise the question, so I will continue to raise the question. Two doubts that emerge from what you just said. One, when you cite GDP numbers, the fact is those numbers also conceal possibly the reality that we've emerged from a low base. There are economists who say that if you discount the fact that we've emerged from a low base during the COVID years, go back to 2019-20, we are still at an average of 3.5 growth rate, which is a low to middling growth rate. So how much is that 7% plus conceal the fact that we are emerging from a very low base in the COVID years?
So, there are a few problems with this, Rajdeep. Firstly, and I'm sure you would have seen, I had written a piece in the Times of India where I had shown the growth not only for India but for the top 10 countries over a 3-year period, taking into account the base effect, taking into account the fact that during the pandemic year, every country, not only India, had a growth decline, and shown that India had the largest growth during this 3-year period over the top 10 economies. Point number one. Second point, I think you would you'd remember very well when we had made the prediction about the V-shaped recovery, people were basically didn't even believe it at that point in time. So if they are talking about now the base effect, and having at that time not believed that there will indeed be the base effect coming about because of the V-shaped recovery, I think you can't have it both ways.
Even the word V. Even the word V generates controversy. There are those who suggest it's more like K-shaped. There are certain areas where we've grown, other areas where we have not. I mean, indigenous manufacturing still hasn't perhaps picked up to the extent that one would like it to. Yeah. There are still question marks over certain sectors. So therefore, are you willing to concede that maybe rather than being gung-ho over a V-shaped recovery, it's a more gradual K-shaped recovery?
No, so actually, and I've said this before, Rajdeep, and I think it's important to repeat this, that this argument or this claim that the recovery is K-shaped is disingenuous, and I'll tell you why. Because even in any year, the best years or in a crisis year, growth across sectors is never uniform. Like the five fingers in a hand, they're actually of different sizes. If you take any year, it's not as if manufacturing, services and agriculture grow at the same rate. So, this is something that's an intrinsic feature of an economy always. So, just to then say that for the particular time of the pandemic, growth rates are different and therefore it's a K-shaped recovery, I think makes it very, very clear that the argument is disingenuous. Now, if you look at even specifically the crisis period, take the previous crisis, for instance, the global financial crisis. During that time, it was actually manufacturing, that did well. Services did not do as much. In fact, actually, it was the other way around. Now, that is also, people could have called that a K-shaped recovery or whatever it was. So my point here is that it is not a characteristic of just the COVID period. Any year you pick up, you show me a particular year, not only for India or any other economy, where every sector has grown at the same rate.
Because the fact is that when you throw numbers at us, particularly the GDP numbers, there are those who say those numbers do not give the complete picture of this country, A, because of the low base that I mentioned, B, also because they don't account for the unorganized agriculture sector, unorganized non-agriculture sector, which in a way is the one which has hurt the most in the post-COVID period.
Rajdeep, when I actually give you an argument, you mentioned about the base effect, and I actually told you the data. That over a 3-year period, India, among the large economies, accounting for the base effect, has had the best growth. So please accept that argument and then let's move on. I think that claim is not on very solid ground. I think India indeed has displayed very good, growth out of recovery, out of COVID, because, and here I think it's not an accident that India has had actually such good performance, because we anticipated, unlike any of the other economies, that COVID is going to be a big supply side shock. And the measures that were taken actually were a good balance of both the demand and the supply side measures, which is why in my time where, because the twin crisis, both the COVID and the Ukraine war, you have advanced economies facing between 2.5 to 4 times their historical average inflation. India's inflation has been actually less than its historical average. So not only have we come out with very strong macroeconomic fundamentals, unlike the fragile 5 performance during the global financial crisis, we've also had very strong growth. So I don't think we needed a G20 as actually a proof of the recovery. G20, as I've said, is essentially just signaling the stature that India has now come to command in the global community.
I'll come to the G20 in a moment, but the agriculture sector is the one which is seen to have suffered.
If you look at, and there are enough academic studies now, if you look at the paper by Dr. Arvind Panagaria, the former vice chairman of Niti Aayog, he's actually used data showing, the fact that recovery, if you separate by urban versus rural areas, looking at employment as well, recovery has indeed now been complete. If you look at the PLFS data, if you look at employment has already recovered beyond pre-COVID levels. So I think, when you let the data speak, rather than go for particular narratives, I think the claims that you're making are clearly, they do not have any ground.
You mentioned G20 and the fact that the G20 in a sense reflects what you believe is India's emergence as a leading economy. Now there will be those who will say, yes, we are the 5th largest economy in the world, but even among the G20 we have the lowest per capita income. That we are the country with the maximum number of poor. 16.4% of our population remains below the poverty line. The next is South Africa with about 6.4%. These are real concerns again going ahead. Inequalities remains a major concern.
No, look, here as well, I think let's go by so for a population of 1.4 billion, clearly, when you have a base like that, obviously per capita income in dollar terms, when you compare, actually will be lower. But the right way to compare is always using purchasing power parity, because the dollar, what it can purchase, let's say, in the US versus what it can do in India is different, right? And when you use purchasing power parity, India does not look, as sort of as behind in terms of per capita, when you come to look at that. compared to other countries. That's point number one. Second, when you talk about inequality, I think, because of the inclusive nature of growth, especially through the digital infrastructure that India has created. Now we have more than 500 million bank accounts, and each of these bank accounts are being used by the poor. So through the use of the public digital infrastructure, India has been able to really make growth inclusive. And this is being shown, if I refer to the paper by Dr. Arvind Panagaria, where he actually shows that inequality, if anything, has actually declined during the last 3-4 years. Inequality has not gone up, and this is using the PLFS data. Again, so when you look at the data carefully, some of the claims actually, which are sort of narratives that are spun, I think do not have as much.
So you don't accept the fact that income inequalities remains the major challenge going ahead, that for a country like India, as we sort of, project ourselves to the world as this fastest growing economy, that will remain the big challenge. Even when I look income inequalities, and then I come to social sector, which is health and education. If you look at per capita investment in education, per capita income in health, we are the lowest still among the G20 countries. So critical areas still remain before we can truly claim to be, in a sense, the rising power that we now hope to become one day.
So I think, we have to be very careful here to not keep moving the targets here. First, when you started out, we're talking about the macroeconomics. We're talking about growth. I don't think anybody here is going to contend that there is no work to be done. Let's be very clear. When I'm talking about inequality, I'm talking about the change in inequality, because the narrative that a lot of, people, especially those that are sympathetic to your kind of arguments.
My argument is to ask the questions.
Let me finish. Actually, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about those economists that are actually sympathetic to your kind of arguments. They basically contended that inequality is rising. I'm not saying inequality in terms of the level is something that we should not be working on. We certainly should be. But what I'm saying, when you look at the data and papers written by very credible people like Dr. Arvind Panagaria, during this 3-year period, inequality has not gone up. That is what I'm saying. I'm not saying inequality is something that we should not be working on.